"Let her marry the cripple then," the old man said, and the whole hall of Standish Court seemed to hold its breath around the words, "Since she is too proud for any honest suitor and too poor to be choice, let her have the beggar at the gate. It is more than she deserves." Garvan, seated on the low stone bench by the servant's door with a filthy blanket across his knees and a crutch leaning against his shoulder, did not lift his head. He had learned, in the 11 days he had spent playing this part, that a man who kept his eyes down was invisible in a way no title had ever made him, and invisibility, he had discovered, was the only honest window a great house ever offered. So he watched from beneath the grey hood he had not washed since he came here, and he listened, and he let them believe the ragged thing by the door had no more understanding than the dog that slept beside him. It was a strange thing to be the Duke of Dunstone and to be spoken of by a country squire as if one were astray to be given away. 3 counties trembled at his name. Ministers wrote to him twice in a week and waited a fortnight, grateful, for his reply. He had turned duchesses out of his drawing-room for less than the insolence this room breathed with every breath, and he had a temper that men who had felt it did not speak of afterward. Yet here he sat in another man's rags, and the great secret of it warmed him and shamed him at once, because he had come to Standish Court to learn precisely such things as this, how the low were spoken of when the powerful believed no one was listening. The old man was Sir Fenwick Standish, and he was not, Garvan had already decided, a wicked man so much as a weak and frightened one, which in his experience did more harm than plain wickedness ever managed. He stood at the head of the long table with his gouty foot propped on a stool and a letter crushed in his fist, and the letter, Garvan had gathered, was from a creditor in the city who was no longer content to wait. Poverty had come into this house the way damp comes into a wall, slowly and from beneath, and it had made the master of it a man who would agree to almost anything if only he need not look too closely at what he had agreed to. Garvan had known such men in his own dealings. They were more dangerous than any villain, for a villain at least chose his course, while a frightened man was merely a door through which crueller people walked. Around him pressed the others, a lean clergyman with a wet mouth, 2 cousins in travelling clothes, and nearest the fire, warming her rings, the woman they called Mrs. Charnley, Cornelia Charnley. He had heard the name whispered in the kitchen with the particular hatred servants reserve for those who rule them without paying them. She was a handsome widow of perhaps 40, gowned far beyond the means of this shabby house, and she had installed herself at Sir Fenwick's elbow the way ivy installs itself upon a dying oak, with an air of tender concern and a grip that would pull the whole thing down before it let go. It was she who had brought the matter of the beggar to the table. It was she who had smiled while she did it. "You are too good, Sir Fenwick," she said now, and her voice was warm as spiced wine and every bit as false. A lesser man would have turned the girl out entire. But to give her a husband, even such a husband, why, it is charity itself. No one could say you had not done your Christian duty by your brother's child. No one, the wet-mowed clergyman agreed. Garvan's hand, hidden under the blanket, closed slowly into a fist, his brother's child. So the girl was a niece then, a poor relation, an orphan very likely, kept in this house on sufferance and now to be swept out of it under the decent cover of a wedding ring. He had come here following a thread he scarcely understood himself, a rumour carried to him by his steward of a young woman in the North Country who had given her own cloak to a freezing tinker on the Dunstone road and asked no name and no thanks for it. That was all. A cloak given in the cold to a stranger by a woman who did not know she was watched. It was a small thing. It should have meant nothing to a man of his rank and his griefs. It had meant to Garvan everything, because it was the one thing in 3 years he had heard of that he could not explain by greed. He had buried a betrothal 3 years gone. He did not think of it now if he could help it, and he could seldom help it. Her name had been Sabine, and she had been beautiful, and she had wept very prettily at his side for 8 months, while she counted his rooms and his rents behind her eyes. And he had found her out at last in a lamplit corridor speaking to another man of how she would spend the Dunstone money once the old Duke's son was safely wed and safely bored. He had said nothing. He had simply become from that hour a colder man than he had been, and a lonelier one, and one who believed, with the whole cold conviction of his soul that no woman living could look at a duke and see anything but the gold behind him. So he had done the only thing a proud and wounded man could think to do. He had put off the gold, he had put on rags, and he had come to find, if such a thing existed anywhere under heaven, one heart that would be kind to a man who had nothing to give it back. "And where is the creature?" said one of the travelling cousins, glancing about with distaste, as though the girl herself were the beggar. "Let us have it done and be gone before the roads freeze. I have no wish to be snowed up in a house of debtors, cousin, over a matter of a servant's wedding." "She is not a servant," Sir Fenwick said faintly, and then, when Cornelia's eyes touched him, said nothing more at all, so that the correction died half-born in the smoky air, and told Garvin more about the whole sad household than an hour of plain speech could have done. "She is fetching the wine," Cornelia said. "I sent her myself. It does a girl good to be useful, when usefulness is all she has left to offer." Garvin lifted his eyes then, only a little, only enough, and looked toward the door through which the girl would come. She came a moment after, and he knew her at once, though he had never seen her face, because she carried the tray the way a person carries a thing they mean to set down whole and unbroken, no matter how their hands are shaking. She was not beautiful in the way Sabine had been beautiful, all polish and candlelight. She was tall and plainly dressed in a grey wool gown that had been turned and mended at the cuff more than once, and her dark hair was drawn back without a single ornament, and her face was quiet. That was the word that came to him and would not leave. Quiet. Not cowed, not sullen, not sly. Only very still, the way deep water is still, with a great deal moving underneath that a careless man would never see. She set the tray down. She poured for Sir Fenwick first, and then for the cousins, and then, without being asked and without any change in her calm, for the clergyman and for Cornelia Charnley, who did not thank her. When the last glass was filled, she did a thing that no one else in the room appeared to mark. But that Garvin, who marked everything from his low corner, saw plainly. She carried the last measure of the wine, the little that remained, not back to the sideboard but to the servant girl hovering in the passage, a thin shivering child of perhaps 12, and pressed it into her hands with a word too soft to hear, a small thing, a crust of kindness spared from her own bad hour. It was, he thought, the cloak on the Dunstone road all over again, done here under the eyes of the very people who despised her for having nothing to give. And Garvin, watching, understood that she already knew. Some servant had told her, or she had read it in their faces at the door. She had come in already knowing that they were about to give her away. Yet her hand did not tremble now that there was wine in it to spill. She had done her trembling in the passage, alone, where none of them could use it against her. He found that he admired that more than he had admired anything in a long while, and the admiration frightened him a little, coming so easily from a heart he had thought he had locked for good. "Leontine," Sir Fenwick said, not unkindly, in the manner of a man who has decided to be gentle because it costs him less than being cruel. "Come here, child. There is a matter to be settled." "I am here, uncle," she said. Her voice was low and even. She did not come nearer than she had to. "You are 23, he said, and you have no fortune, as you know, your father having left you nothing but debts and a great many books, and I cannot keep you forever, as you also know. God rest your father. Mrs. Charnley has been so good as to point out to me that a woman of your years unwed is a burden upon a house and a whisper upon its name. It is time you were settled. If you have found me a situation, uncle," she said, "as a governess or a companion, I will take it gladly and be no more trouble to you. I asked you for nothing but that." "He has found you better than a situation." Cornelia rose from the fire, her silks whispering, and crossed the room to stand the girl the way a cat stands beside a bird it is not yet quite finished with. "He has found you a husband. There. Is that not more than a penniless orphan could have prayed for? A husband, and this very night." Garvin saw the girl's eyes move, one flick, no more, toward the door where the ragman sat, and then back. She had understood the shape of it before another word was said. Still she asked, because dignity sometimes requires a person to make cruelty say its own name aloud rather than do its work in hints. "And who is the gentleman?" The clergyman laughed, a wet unpleasant sound. Cornelia smiled and lifted one white hand toward the servant's door. toward the bench, toward Garvin in his blanket and his filth and his lie. "There," she said, "your bridegroom. We took him in off the Marrowby Road a fortnight since, out of charity, and a sorrier bit of charity I never saw, lame in one leg, not a penny to his name, no more family than a milestone. But he is a man, and he is baptized, and Mr. Peveril here is a clergyman, and there is a ring." She let the words fall one by one, each a small stone dropped into a well, listening for the splash. "You shall be wed within the hour, and then, my dear, you shall be his to keep and his to feed, and Standish Court shall be quit of you both." The room laughed. Not all of it. The cousins only smirked, and Sir Fenwick looked away into the fire as a man does who has let himself be led somewhere he does not quite like the smell of. But Cornelia laughed, low and delighted, and the clergyman with her. They were waiting, Garvin saw, for the girl to break. That was the whole savour of the thing for them. They had built this little theatre of humiliation, and now they wanted their coin. The tears, the pleading, the wild refusal that would let them call her ungrateful, or the collapse that would let them call her weak. It was, he thought, the oldest cruelty in the world to hurt a person and then require them to entertain you with their hurting. Leontine Standish did not give it to them. She looked at last and fully at the man on the bench by the door. Garvin felt her gaze arrive on him and had to hold himself from flinching under it, for it was not the look he had grown used to in that house, the flick of disgust, the sliding away. The eyes that passed over a beggar as they pass over a heap of rags, because to see him would be to owe him something. She looked at him as though he were a man. She looked at his bowed shoulders and his hidden face and the crotch against them, and something in her own face changed, not to horror, which he could have borne, and not to scorn, which he half expected, but to a kind of grave, considering pity that had no contempt anywhere in it at all. As if she were sorry, not for herself, for him, for the poor lame stranger who was being handed a friendless bride the way one is handed a burden, without his leave any more than hers. "Has anyone," she said quietly, still looking at Garvin, "asked the gentleman whether he is willing?" The laughter stopped. "Willing," Cornelia repeated, as though the girl had spoken in Greek. "He is a man, you have said so yourself." Leontine set down the wine jug she still held, set it down carefully on the tray so that it should not fall, and she straightened, and Garvin saw for the first time how tall she truly stood when she was not bending over a task. "He is baptized, you have said. Then he has a soul, and a will, and the right to be asked before he is married off, in a jest to amuse a room. I am poor, madam. I know it better than you can teach me. But I have never yet been so poor that I forgot a beggar at the gate is a person, and I do not think I shall learn it tonight in this company, of all the nights and all the company in the world." It was very quietly said. It was not raised, not shrill, not pleading. And it landed in that warm crowded room like a stone through a window, so that Sir Fenwick shifted his gatty foot and would not meet her eye, and one of the cousins coughed, and Cornelia Charnley's handsome face went, for one unguarded instant, absolutely white with a fury she had not expected to feel, the particular fury of one who has set a trap for a mouse and been looked in the eye by a woman. And Garvin, on his bench with the blanket over his knees and the ruin of his name and rank held safe under a grey hood, felt his chest fill with something he had not felt in 3 years and had come near to believing he never would again. He had come here to be given a heart's proof, one small honest thing, a cloak in the cold. He had not dared to hope for this, that the woman would defend not herself, but him, the nothing at the door, the lie he was wearing, with the last small store of dignity a cruel house had left her. He raised his head. Under the hood, where none could see, the Duke of Dunstone was looking at Leontine Standish as though the roof had come off the world and let the first light in. "Willing or no," said Cornelia, recovering, her voice gone hard and bright as struck flint, "it is done, girl, and your fine speeches change nothing. Mr. Peveril, fetch your book. They will be married before this fire tonight, and I will hear no more of souls and wills from a creature who owns neither a shilling nor a name worth saying. Fetch it." The clergyman went for his book. Sir Fenwick, glad to be borne along, called for the ring. The cousins rose. And Leontine Standish stood in the middle of them, pale and steady, a poor woman about to be shackled to a pauper for the crime of having no money and too much pride, and she turned once more, in all that hard bright noise, to look at the ragged stranger she thought she was condemned to. as if to tell him without a word that whatever they did to the two of them tonight, she at least was sorry, and she at least would be kind. Garvin gathered the crutch beneath his arm. It was time, he understood, to stand and to let them lead him, limping and silent and unknown, to the fire and the book and the ring, and the beginning of the only true thing he had wanted in his whole guarded life. He rose, and as he rose, hidden in the shadow of the door, the Duke of Dunstone made his silent vow that this woman who had defended a beggar would never, so long as he drew breath, be handed to anyone again as though she were nothing, and that before he was done, the whole of this laughing room would learn exactly whom they had given away tonight. And to whom. They led him to the fire. Two of the cousins took him under the arms as though he were a sack of meal, and Garvin let them, keeping his weight upon the crutch, keeping the drag in his left foot that he had practiced in a dozen inn-yards until it had become nearly true. The heat of the great hearth struck his face. He kept his chin low, the grey hood forward, and looked at the world through the narrow slot the cloth allowed him, a cracked flagstone, the muddy hem of Cornelia Charnley's gown, and when they turned him, the toes of a pair of shoes so worn that the leather had gone soft and pale at the seams, and the plain dark stuff of a skirt mended so many times that the mending had itself been mended. Leontine Standish's shoes. He did not raise his eyes past them. He did not need to. He had already, in the last hour, learned that face by heart, the way a man learns a thing he means never to lose. "Stand him there," Cornelia said, "there by her, so the parson may see them both and be quick. Mr. Peveril, we are all of us cold and it grows late. You need not trouble with the whole of it. The binding words will serve." The clergyman opened his book with the reluctance of a man wading into water he knew to be foul. Garvin had marked him already for what he was, a poor curate in the pocket of a rich house, wanting only to be gone. "There is a form, Miss Charnley," Peveril said, "that the church requires." "Then say the part that binds and leave off the part that comforts," she answered, "for there is to be no comfort in it. That is rather the point." A little laugh went round the cousins. Garvin felt it move across his shoulders like a draught. Beside him, close enough now that he could hear the small, unsteady rhythm of her breathing, Leontine Standish did not laugh, and did not flinch, and did not speak. She stood. That was all. She stood as though standing were itself a kind of answer, and she kept her hands folded before her, and the firelight found the poor ornament she owned, a thin ribbon at her throat, washed near to no colour at all, and made even that look, for a moment, like something a woman might have chosen with care. He had spent his life among women who performed. He knew the whole vocabulary of it, the practised droop of a lash, the small brave tremble offered up to be admired, the sorrow arranged upon a face like flowers in a bowl. Cornelia Charnley performed even now, standing over her own cruelty with her chin lifted and her eyes bright, playing the part of the just mistress to an audience of cousins who would applaud whatever she did. And here beside him was a woman who did none of it, who reached for nothing, who bore the worst hour of her life without once trying to make it look upon her face like anything but what it was. Garvin had crossed half of England in rags to find one heart that did not perform. He had not thought to find it standing at his own left hand, waiting to be married to him. Peveril began. He said the binding words in a low, hurrying voice, skipping, as bid, the passages of blessing and of grace, so that what was left was only the iron of the thing, the having and the holding, the keeping, the promise wrung out and handed over in the cold. When he came to the place where the man must answer, he lifted his eyes to the hooded figure with something like apology, as if to a beast at the shambles. "Will you," Peveril asked, "have this woman?" "I will," said Garvin. He said it low and rough, and had roughened his voice for weeks, so that it should carry nothing of the drawing-room in it. But he said it too soon. He said it before the poor man had reached the end of his question, said it the instant the shape of it was clear, and he said it with a plainness that had no begging in it anywhere. For half a breath the room seemed to feel small wrongness in it and not to know where the wrongness lay, a shilling that rings true when the ear expects lead. Cornelia's chin came up a little. Peveril blinked. Then it passed as such things pass, swallowed by the general contempt, and no one thought on it further. A beggar, after all, might be eager, having got in one night more than he could hope for in a lifetime. A roof, a wife, a place at the edge of a great man's fire. Garvin lowered his head another inch and let them believe it. "And will you?" Peveril said, turning to the woman, and here his voice gentled without his meaning it to, have this man to be your wedded husband, to live together. I will. She answered as he had answered, before the end of it, and Garvan, who had schooled every muscle of his face for this hour, who had stood unmoved through the mockery of the whole cruel evening, felt the two small words go into him like a blade slipped clean between the ribs, painless and mortal. She had not hesitated. They had given her a ruin in rags, a man they swore was lame and landless and worth nothing on the earth, and offered the match to her as a punishment and a shame, and she had said, I will, in a steady voice, as though a vow were a vow though it be made to the lowest creature living, and as though she would sooner make an honest promise to a beggar than a false one to a lord. He wanted absurdly, savagely, to lift the hood then and there and let her see the whole of it. He did not. He had come too far. And there was too much yet he needed to be sure of, and the wanting itself frightened him, for he knew that wanting, knew where it had led him 3 years past, when a beautiful woman had looked at him with soft eyes and he had believed the softness meant himself, and had learned, on the eve of everything, that had never meant anything but the coronet and the acres and the name of Dunstone. He had sworn then that no one should ever again love the title in his stead, and call it loving him. He had built the whole of this mad masquerade upon that oath. He held to it now, though it cost him, and kept the hood down. The ring, Cornelia said. There was of course no ring. A beggar had none, and she had counted on that, and now she produced it as the last flourish of her scorn. A wretched thing of tin or base pewter greened at the edge, plucked no doubt from some servant's box, worth less than the breath spent fetching it. She set it in Garvan's palm with 2 fingers, as one lays a coin before a leper. There, she said, it suits the match. Put it on her and be done. He turned to Leontine Standish. It was the first time he had faced her fully since they had brought him in, and to do it he had to raise his head. And for the space of that turning the firelight came up under the hood, and he could see her whole, the pale steady face, the dark eyes with all their weariness and none of their pride broken, the mouth held soft against every reason it had to go hard. She was looking at his hand. She was looking at his hand, and Garvan understood, a beat too late, what she was seeing. He had blacked his nails with ash. He had rubbed his knuckles with dirt from the road and let the cold roughen them, and had bound one wrist in filthy rag as though it were hurt. But a man's hands are not so easily unmade as his coat. Under the grime the fingers were long and unbroken, and had never gripped a spade nor hauled a net nor known any labour harder than a rein or a pen. The nails, for all the ash, were sound, and the hand that held the miserable ring held it. From long unthinking habit, the way a man holds a thing he has been taught since childhood to hold with care, lightly, precisely as one might offer a jewel. A beggar's hand would have closed on it in a fist. His had not. Leontine's eyes lifted from the hand to the shadow where his face should be, and something moved in them, not fear, not the flat greed of a woman scenting advantage, but a quick, quiet, inward question there and then folded away. She had seen, and she said nothing, asked nothing, made nothing of it before that watching room. She only drew her hand a little from her sleeve and gave it him to be married, and Garvan, whose whole safety in that house hung upon her silence, and who had done nothing to earn it, felt the second blade go in beside the first. He took her hand. It was cold and worked and small in his, and it trembled once and then was still, and he slid the base metal onto her finger over the roughened knuckle as gently as ever a man set gold upon a bride at the great door of a cathedral. He heard Cornelia's little sound of disgust at the tenderness of it. He did not care. For one moment there was nothing in the whole loud room but the cold hand in his warm one, and the ugly ring going home, and her eyes on him, and he held the hand a heartbeat past the need of it, unwilling, when it came to it, to let go. Man and wife, Peveril said quickly, and shut his book. God help them. God has better things to do, said Cornelia, and turned away, and the thing was done. What followed came fast and mean, as such nights do. There was no feast. There was no toast that was not a jeer. Sir Fenwick, red now with the wine he had drunk to hold his own courage up, laughed too loud and told the cousins that the estate was well rid of a costly mouth, and that the beggar had got the better bargain, and let his eyes rest on Leontine with a look that made Garvan's free hand curl slowly, out of sight, into a fist beneath the blanket. Cornelia decreed that the pair of them should not sit at the fire that was for their betters, but be put for the night in the old still room off the scullery, where there was a hearth of sorts and a truss of straw, and that in the morning the beggar could take his bride and his blessing and be gone from the gates before the house was awake to be shamed by the sight of them. Take them out, she said. I am tired of looking at charity. A servant came, an old man, stooped with a lantern, the only creature in that house who had not once laughed the whole evening through. He led them down a stone passage away from the light, and Garvan, leaning hard on the crutch and dragging the false lameness after him, kept his head down and watched the old man's boots. At the still room door the servant lifted the lantern to find the latch, and its light swung up across the two of them, and fell full for an instant on Garvan's downturned face within the hood. The old man went very still. Garvan felt it, the pause, the caught breath. The lantern held one moment too long and too high, and knew, with a cold drop of the heart, that he had been seen. He raised his eyes just enough to meet the servant's, and what he found there was not the beginning of a shout, but the last of a long memory, an old face working, the eyes narrowing and then widening, the mouth opening on a word it did not, in the end, dare to say. The man had served somewhere, once some great house, had stood perhaps at the edge of some assembly where a young lord went by, and had looked now upon a beggar and seen, rising through the grime like a face through water, someone he could almost name. Garvan held his gaze and very slightly shook his head. Not now, not a word. And the old servant, God knew why, out of the fellow feeling for the low, or the deep trained silence of a lifetime of service, or only the sense that whatever the truth of this ragged man, it was no friend to the mistress of the house, closed his mouth. He set the lantern on the sill. He said, in a voice gone oddly gentle, "There's kindling laid, and a jar of water, and the door bolts on the inside if you've a mind." And to Leontine, with a small stiff bow that no one had bowed to her all that evening, he added, "There's bread wrapped in the crock, miss. It's good." Bake was Tuesday. Then he was gone, and his lantern light with him, and the two of them stood alone in the dark of the little stone room with only the low glow of a raked fire between them. For a moment neither moved. Garvan heard her breathing steady itself, heard the rustle as she found the fire and knelt and coaxed the kindling to it with a few soft breaths of her own, and the flame came up and threw her shadow tall against the whitewashed wall. She rose. She turned to him, and there in the poor light, with the whole cruel house shut away behind a bolted door, Leontine Standish looked at the man they had chained her to, and Garvan braced himself for what surely must come now, the tears, the reproaches, the bitter reckoning of a woman finding herself ruined, or worse. If she had truly guessed his hands, the sudden shrewd civility of one who thinks she has caught the scent of gain. Neither came. "You are cold," she said, "and you have stood a long while on that foot. Come and sit." That was all. There was no self-pity in it and no calculation. There was only, in the plain words, a small unhurried kindness offered to a stranger she believed to be the poorest thing in England, offered freely, in the 1 hour of her life when she had every earthly reason to think first of her own wreck and not at all of his. She drew the truss of straw nearer the hearth with her worn shoe and spread her own thin shawl upon it, her only warmth given up without a word, and she stood waiting to help him down as though he were something worth attending. Garvan did not move. He could not. He stood in the doorway of that mean little room, leaning on a crutch he did not need, wearing the rags of a lie, and he looked at her across the firelight and found he could not look away, not from the tired eyes that held no grievance, not from the mended skirt, not from the hand still marked by the cold of the false ring he had given her. Every guard he had carried into this house, every hard resolution 3 years in the building, stood suddenly like a wall of paper before a rising tide. He had come to be given one small honest proof of a true heart. He had not reckoned on being undone by it. He had not reckoned on her at all. "Sir," she said, for he had gone so still, "will you not sit? I mean you no harm. Whatever they have made of this," and here, for the first and only time, her steady voice wavered, and steadied again, "whatever they have made of it, you and I need not be unkind to one another. We are, it seems, all the family either of us has left. Come and sit by the fire." He came. He crossed the little room with the crutch and the drag of the false foot, and he lowered himself onto the straw she had spread, and she knelt and set the jar of water near the hearth to take the chill from it. and unwrapped the bread from the crock as though it were a thing to be done gravely and well. She broke it and gave him the larger half, without a moment's weighing of it, and Garvin, who dined most nights off silver he never troubled to see, looked at the coarse dark bread in his blackened hand and could not for a moment trust his voice to take it. "You do not ask me anything," he said at last, low and rough as he could keep it. "A woman married against her will. I had thought you would have questions of me." "I have a great many," she said, sitting back on her heels, the firelight on her tired face. "But you are as ill-used tonight as I am, and I do not think you chose this any more than I did. Questions can keep till morning. A cold man cannot." She considered him a moment, the hood, the rag, the hand. "You need not tell me who you are," she added quietly. "I have learned it is safer in this house not to know the half of what one sees." She said it plainly, without a hook in it, without the least angling after what she plainly suspected she had glimpsed, and turned back to the fire as though she had said nothing at all, and left the whole vast weight of his secret lying untouched on the ground between them, hers to lift and never lifted. Garvin sat with the bread in his hand and his heart going like a hammer, and thought that he had never in his life been shown such mercy by anyone who stood to gain nothing by it. And the Duke of Dunstone, who had been feared across 3 counties and had thought his heart a shut and shuttered house, stood in the dark with his throat gone tight and his eyes stinging in the shadow of the hood, and understood that he was already, hopelessly, past the point of turning back. So it was done. The thin worn ring that Cornelia Charnley had drawn from her own reticule, a band so light it might have been struck for a child, and given, Garvin did not doubt, precisely because it was the cheapest thing in her keeping, sat now upon Leontine Standish's finger. And Mr. Peveril had shut his book with the satisfied snap of a man closing an account, and the fire had witnessed a marriage that no one in the room, but the two who had made it, had troubled to take seriously. Garvin stood at her side upon his crutch with his head bowed and his hood drawn, a lame stranger yoked in an hour to a woman he had watched for 11 days, and would have crossed 3 counties to reach, and he thought, with a bitterness that surprised him by its heat, that never in all his life had he been given so precious a thing by people who believed they were giving him nothing at all. He had expected them, when the words were said, to turn the two of them out into the dark and be rid of the jest. He had underestimated Cornelia's appetite. A cruelty was not, to her, complete until it had been enjoyed at leisure and before an audience, and so she had spent the last hour of the afternoon sending out to the nearer houses of the neighborhood, and now, as the early dark came down and the candles were lit in the cold dining-room that Standish Court could no longer afford to warm, a half-dozen of the local gentry were arriving in their cloaks and their curiosity to make merry over the poor relation's wedding, as they might have gathered to watch a bear baited in a yard. They were seated at the long table with a great show of ceremony, and the ceremony was the whole of the malice, for every honour done that night was done to wound. Leontine was placed at the head, in Sir Fenwick's own carved chair, and a wreath of dead December ivy was set crookedly upon a dark hair by the younger of the travelling cousins amid a gust of laughter, and she was toasted as the bride and the great lady of the feast, she in her turned grey wool, with her hands reddened from the day's labour, seated like a queen of misrule above a table that would not have been laid at all had the neighbours not each sent round a covered dish, so that even the food that mocked her was charity. Garvin they set at the very foot, below the salt, below the cousin's travelling servant, upon a 3-legged stool that put his chin near the level of the board, and this too was arranged so that the length of the whole table should lie between husband and wife, that the guests might look from the ivy-crowned pauper's bride at one end to the huddled beggar at the other, and have their laugh at the great distance love had bridged that day. "To the happy pair," said the elder cousin, rising, swaying a little, for the neighbours had brought wine as well as dishes, and he had already been generous with himself, "to the Duchess of the Ditch and her lord of the Marrowby Road. May they be as rich in years as they are in everything else." The table laughed. "Tell us, cousin, where shall you take your wedding journey? Bath, is it? Or only so far as the parish poorhouse, and back before the gate is locked?" "Not so far as that, I think," said Leontine, and her voice went down the table clear and unhurried and entirely without heat, so that the laughter, which had been waiting to swell, faltered and did not quite know where to fall. "I have found that a person may travel a very long way, cousin, and see a great deal of the world's true character, without once leaving the chair they are sitting in. I have learned more of certain people's hearts across this one supper table than I should have learned of them in a 12-month on the road." It was so mildly said that a full breath passed before the sharper of the guests understood they had been struck, and by then it was too late to answer without confessing the blow had landed. The elder cousin sat down more heavily than he had risen, and Garvan, at the foot of the table with his face hidden and his knuckles whitening on the head of his crutch, felt again the thing he had felt in the hall that afternoon, a fierce, unlooked-for gladness, close kin to pride, that he had no right yet to feel and could no more govern than a man can govern the tide. Cornelia had marked it too, that quiet parry, and it displeased her, for the sport was not going as she had staged it. She rose, and the candle-light made a gracious warmth of her handsome face, and she came round the table with her glass in her hand, all tender solicitude, the way she did everything cruel. "You must forgive my cousin's whip, my dear," she said, laying her ringed hand upon Leontine's shoulder as one soothes a horse one means shortly to whip. "We are all so very fond of you. Indeed, I have been saying to Lady Meech only this hour how nobly you bear your change of fortune, for it is a change, is it not? Your poor father, God rest him, filled your head with Latin and left your pockets with nothing, and now here you sit, wed to a man who cannot so much as stand to toast his own bride." She turned to the table, warming to it. "Come, we must have the bridegroom's health, and hear him give us his good wishes. Stand, sir, stand and speak for your wife. Surely so fine a lady is worth the trouble of your one good leg." The laughter began again, uglier now, and one of the neighbours took up the cry, "Stand, stand." And the cousins beat the table, and it was, Garvan understood with a cold clarity, the thing they had truly gathered for, not to mock the bride, who would not break, but to bait the beggar, to make the ragged silent thing at the foot of the board rise and stammer and shuffle for their amusement, and so drag his wife down into his own shame before the whole neighbourhood. They wanted him to perform his ruin. They wanted her to sit crowned in her dead ivy and watch it. He had meant to bear it. He had told himself, through 11 days of it, that a man learns nothing behind a mask if he tears the mask off at the first sting to his pride, and that his pride, in any case, had been the ruin of him once and should be given no further trust. He had meant to keep his eyes down and let them have their beggar, but then he saw Leontine's hand, where it lay upon the table beside the untouched glass they had poured her, close very slowly into a fist, not for herself. She had borne their whole freight of malice without a tremor for herself. But at the sound of them turning upon him, the friendless creature she believed herself chained to, the one soul in that room lower and more helpless than she was, she had defended him in the hall when she had nothing. She was gathering herself, he saw, to defend him again now, and it would cost her the last of the standing she had left, and she was going to spend it anyway. And Garvan found that he was on his feet. He did not remember deciding to rise. He only found himself risen, the crutch taken up beneath his arm, standing at the foot of the long table with the dead of a great house's malice all turned toward him and his hood fallen back a little from a face they had never troubled to look at. He kept the limp, he kept the stoop and the roughened labourer's burr he had practised on the road, but when he spoke he let some small part of the other man come up into his voice, the man who had turned duchesses from his drawing-room, the man whom ministers waited a fortnight to hear. No more than a thread of it, but enough, the way a single low note under a table of chatter will still every glass in the room without one soul knowing why. "My wife's health has been drunk," he said, "by every mouth at this table but one, and that one grudged it. I'll not stand to be your evening's amusement, and I'll not let her be." The room had gone very quiet, but I'll stand, since you have asked it, to say this much. There is not a person seated between her chair and this stool who has shown me, a stranger and a beggar, the plain kindness she showed me before ever she knew she was to be bound to me. And if that is poverty, then God keep me poor, and God help the rich in this house, for they will need it more than I. He sat down. It had taken perhaps a quarter of a minute, and in the silence that followed it, a silence with an edge to it, a silence in which more than one of the neighbours glanced at the beggar at the foot of the board with a sudden puzzled uncertainty they could not have named, Cornelia Charnley's face did the thing Garvin had seen it do once already that day. Went white and still with a fury the deeper for being unaccountable, as though she had reached to move a piece upon a board and found it look back at her. "How prettily the tinker preaches," she said at last, but her voice had lost its warm silk and come out thin, and she knew it, and it enraged her further. She snatched up her glass. "Enough. The night grows cold and the road's worse. Let the bride and her orator be shown to their lodging, Fenwick. The old gatehouse will do. It has a roof of a kind, and they'll not want for company, there being rats enough to make a congregation. Let them be married in earnest, and let us be spared the sermon." She swept back to her place. The laughter came again at that, dutiful and relieved, glad to be given permission, and under cover of it the guests fell to their dishes and the moment closed over. But it had happened. Garvin had shown a hand he had sworn to keep hidden, and though not one of them had read it aright, he had felt the reading almost begin, and it frightened him and it did not, both at once, that he had risked so much and could not even now be sorry. The thin-serving child, the same to whom Leontine had given the last of the wine that afternoon, was sent to light them across the frozen yard, and she went before them with a horn lantern that shook in her cold hands, and behind her came Leontine, still in her mockery of a crown, until, at the door, she reached up without a word and lifted the dead Evie from her hair and laid it gently upon a bench, as one lays down a thing that has been used unkindly and deserves at least not to be flung. Garvin followed on his crutch. The gatehouse stood at the end of a long walk under bare black limes, a squat cold building of 2 rooms, and the child made them a small fire of the damp wood that was all there was, and bobbed, and fled back toward the lit windows and the warmth she was not to share. And then, for the first time since he had come to Standish Court, the Duke of Dunstone was alone with the woman he had married. She did not weep. He had half feared she would, now that there was no one to be brave for, and had not known what he should do if she did, being a man long out of the habit of any tenderness he could not command. But she did not. She went first to the fire and coaxed it, and then she turned and looked at him, looked, as she had looked in the hall, at the whole of him, the crutch and the rags and the bowed shape of him. And there was in her face none of the loathing a woman might be forgiven who found herself shut for life in a cold room with a beggar, and none of the false gentleness of Cornelia either, but only that grave, steady, considering care that had undone him from the first. "You are not lame," she said. Garvin stood very still. "You favoured the left leg all the day," she said, "and just now when you rose in anger you set your weight upon it and forgot. I do not say it to trap you. I say it so that you need not keep up the lie in here where there is no one to see, if it wearies you. For it must weary a man, to be always guarding the way he stands." She sat down upon the low stool by the hearth, folding her reddened hands in her lap, and she said it as simply as she might have offered him bread. "Whatever you are running from, sir, I shall not carry word of it back to that house. I owe them nothing, and they are none of them worth the lying to. Keep your secret if you wish. I only would not have you spend your strength deceiving the one person here who does not care in the least what you are." For a long moment he could not answer her at all. He had come to this house wearing his ruin like a suit of armour, certain to the marrow of him that no woman drew breath who would look at a man and not first reckon what he was worth. He who had been taught that lesson in a lamplit corridor 3 years gone, and had paid for the teaching with everything warm in him. And here in a rat's gatehouse sat a woman who had this day been crowned in dead leaves and mocked before her neighbours and given away like a lame dog, and who wanted of him nothing, not his name, which she believed was nothing, not his rank, which she could not dream of, not even the comfort of a shared complaint against those who had wronged them both. She wanted only that he need not tire himself lying to her. It was the smallest kindness in the world. It very nearly broke him. "You mistake me," he said carefully, in the beggar's burr, though it cost him now to keep it. "A man may favour a leg from an old hurt without being a liar." "He may," she agreed, unoffended, and the ghost of something that was almost a smile touched the corner of her grave mouth. "Then I have wronged you, and I am sorry for it. And we shall neither of us speak of legs again." She rose and fetched from the dish the child had left a heel of bread and a little cheese, and she broke the bread and gave him the larger half, before she took her own, And Garvin looked at the coarse bread in his rough hand and thought that no dish at any table he had ever sat at, in any house in 3 counties, had been set before him with so little calculation and so much plain decency. "You spoke well tonight," she went on, sitting again. "You ought not to have. It will cost you their goodwill such as it was, and a beggar cannot afford to buy enemies. But you spoke well, and you spoke for me, and no one has done that in this house in a very long while. So I find I cannot scold you for it as I meant to." "Why did you defend me?" he asked her, before he had weighed whether he should. "This afternoon, in the hall. You had trouble enough of your own." She considered it, honestly, the way she seemed to consider everything, turning it over before she gave him an answer she could stand behind. "Because they wished me not to," she said at last. "And because a person is a person, sir, whatever the world has done to their coat. I was taught that by a father the world called a fool for teaching it, and I have never yet found the world in the right and him in the wrong, whatever it cost me to keep his side of the account." She looked into the poor fire. "And because I know a little of what it is to be handed from hand to hand and asked to be grateful, I would not do to another what has been done to me. That is all. It is not so fine a reason as it sounds." It was, Garvin thought, the finest reason he had ever heard given for anything. He sat with the bread untasted in his hand and looked at her across the little fire, and he was aware, with an alarm that had nothing of the drawing-room in it, nothing he knew how to master, that he did not want the night to end, nor the talk, nor this poor cold room, that he wanted to ask her 100 things and hear how she would turn each honestly over before she answered, that he who had schooled himself for 3 years to want nothing and trust no one, was sitting in his enemy's gatehouse in another man's rags and wanting, with a plain and frightening hunger, only to keep her talking to him until the fire went out and the dawn came up over the frozen limes. He set that down within himself very quietly, the way she had set down the ivy, a thing he had not looked to find, and did not yet know what he would do with, and would not, for anything, fling away. For 4 days the snow held the roads of the north country shut as a closed fist, and the cousins who had come to see a poor relation shamed to a wedding found themselves prisoners of the very house they had meant before the candles were cold. It suited Garvin better than he dared let his face show. A thaw would have set him and his bride upon the Marrowby road with a crust and a blessing out of Standish Court forever, and there was too much he had not yet learned. There was. If he was honest with himself in the cold dark of the still room where they had been lodged like 2 beasts, too much he had not yet had of her. So he watched the frost thicken on the little window each morning and told himself it was strategy that made him glad of it, and knew, with the plain contempt he had always kept for men who lied to themselves, that it was not strategy at all. They had not driven him out because they could not, and because they could not, Cornelia Charnley had found uses for him. "A beggar who ate a great man's bread must earn it," she said. And so the Duke of Dunstone had carried coals and split kindling and hauled water up the scullery stair with the drag of his false foot behind him, and had found that the labour, which was meant to break him, taught him the whole house instead. Servants spoke for a man they thought too low to matter. He learned which of them were owed their wages and which were paid in fear. He learned that Sir Fenwick had not been sober past noon in a month, and he learned, from a scullion who did not trouble to lower her voice, that Mrs. Charnley meant to be mistress of Standish Court in name as well as in fact, before the spring was out, and that there was but one thing standing crooked in the door of ambition. The old squire, drunk as he kept himself, would not name Cornelia in his will while his brother's girl yet lived under his roof to reproach him with a dead man's face. Leontin was the flaw in the widow's account. And a flaw, Garvin knew from a lifetime of watching people who wanted things, is a thing that grasping people do not suffer to stand long. He carried that knowledge with him at dusk on the 4th day, when the light had gone blue in the passages and the house had drawn in around its poor fires, and he went to find her. She was not in the still room, nor the kitchen, nor anywhere he had been set to labour. It was the old stooped servant who told him, meeting him in the cold corridor with a rushlight in his hand, and no surprise at all in his lined face, as though he had been waiting these 4 days to be of use. "The book room, off the east stair," the old man said quietly. "She goes there when the light's near gone, and they've no more errands for her. Master keeps no fire in it. Nobody troubles her there. He held Garvin's eye a moment, the way he had held it the first night with the lantern, and again he said nothing of what he plainly knew, and again Garvin wondered by what grace this one servant had chosen silence. "You'll want the second door, past the broken chair," the old man added, and went on his way and left the rushlight burning in a niche behind him as though he had forgotten it, which Garvin did not think he had. He found the room by the cold of it. No fire had been laid there in months. The hearth was black and the air had the still, mineral chill of a place shut away from living, and it was lined floor to ceiling with books that no one at Standish Court but one person had opened in years. Most stood in ruin, swollen with damp, foxed, their gilt gone green, but a corner near the window had been kept. There the spines were dusted and set straight, and there, on a low stool drawn up to catch the last grey daylight from the casement, sat Leontine Standish with a shawl about her shoulders and a small volume on her knee, reading in a cold that would have driven anyone else to the kitchen fire. She did not start when the door gave. She looked up and marked him in the dimness, and something in her face eased that he had not known was guarded until he saw it let go. "You will be perished," she said. "There is no fire. I ought to have warned you. I keep it too long myself, my father always said, past all sense. But the light is good here until the very end of the day." She moved along the window ledge to make him room out of an old, unthinking courtesy, as though the meanest of straw-lodged paupers were company she was glad to shift for. "Sit where it is warmest, such as warm is. What has brought you up here?" he might have said. "I came to be sure they had not touched you today." He might have said any of a dozen true things that would have unmade him in a sentence. "I heard there were books," he said instead, low and rough as he kept his voice, and lowered himself to the settle by the dead hearth, and let the crutch lean where she could see it. "A man gets tired of coals. You read then." She said it without wonder and without suspicion, only marking it, filing it away with all the other things about him she had chosen not to ask, and Garvin remembered her words in the still room, that it was safer in this house not to know the half of what one saw, and felt again the strange humbling of being so carefully, so kindly not examined. "That is more than most in this house can do," she went on, and there was no cruelty in it, only a dry, worn honesty. "My uncle signs his name and reckons his debts, and my Aunt Charnley, she is no aunt of mine, but she will have the title, reads faces, which is a rarer and a colder skill." She turned the little book closed over her thumb. "These were my father's, all of them. He left me nothing else in the world. Tell me," Garvin said, and was ashamed of how much he wanted it. And she told him plainly, sitting in the failing light with her breath a small ghost on the air. Her father had been a scholar of no fortune and less prudence. A younger son who had married for love against his family's wish and been cut off for it, and had kept a little school for gentlemen's sons in a damp town in the fen country, and had spent every shilling that was not owed on more books, because books, he had told his daughter, were the only riches no bailiff could carry off. He had been wrong about that, as it proved. The bailiffs had carried off very nearly all of them when he died, and these few crates that remained had come north with her to Standish Court, only because her uncle had thought them worthless and not troubled to sell them. Her mother she barely remembered. She had kept her father's house and read her father's books and buried him one hard January, and had come at 18 to the door of the only relation she had left in the world, and had been taken in, she was scrupulous to say it, taken in and fed, and given a roof, and set to earn the whole of it thrice over, and told each week what a burden she was to a house that could ill afford charity. "I do not say it to be pitied," she said, and looked at him levelly to be sure he understood it. "I would not have you think I sit up here in the cold nursing my grievances like a fire. I had a father who loved me and taught me Latin and let me argue with him at his own table, which is more than most women get, and more than most of the fine ladies who will not sit in a room with me ever had. I have my health and my wits." A small dry lift of her mouth, as of Tuesday last, "a husband, which I am given to understand is a great prize. I have a great deal. I only have no money, and in this house that is reckoned the same thing as having nothing, and I have never been able to make them see the difference." She looked down at the closed book under her hand. "My father saw it. He would have liked you, I think. He liked a man who came for the books and not the dinner. Garvin sat very still in the cold, and did not trust his voice, and looked at her in the last of the grey light, the mended shawl, the chapped hands folded on the worn cover, the tired mouth that had just made a jest of her own ruin sooner than ask him to grieve over it, and felt the last of the wall he had carried 3 years go quietly to nothing, without a sound, the way a bank of snow gives way and is simply gone. He had crossed half of England to find a heart that wanted nothing of him, and here she sat, a woman who had every reason under heaven to reach for the smallest advantage, and reached for none, who had given her only warmth to a beggar and her only silence to his secret, and asked him for not one thing in return but that he sit where it was warm. He had believed, on the road here, that if such a heart existed he would recognize it, and be satisfied, and go home a man vindicated. He had not reckoned that finding it would ruin him. He wanted, with an H that frightened him, to tell her everything, the name, the rank, the whole mad masquerade, and lay it at her worn shoes and see what she would do. And he did not, 'cause he had loved once where he was deceived. And the thing he could not yet bear was to speak and watch her face change at the word Dunstone, to watch the quiet go out of it and something else come in, and never afterward be sure which of them had been the true one. "You should not have been given away like that," he said at last, roughly. "To me, to anyone, it was a wicked thing." It was, she agreed, simply. Then she looked at him, and the grey light was nearly gone, and her face in it was gentle. "But I will tell you a thing I have told no one, and you may keep it since you keep other things." She hesitated and went on. "When she pointed to you by the door and called you my bridegroom, and the whole room waited for me to weep, I was not sorry it was you. I know how that must sound. I mean that I looked at the man they'd picked to shame me with, and I saw someone as ill-used as I was, someone they thought was nothing, and I thought, at least he will not be cruel to me, for the world has been cruel to him and taught him what it costs. I would sooner be poor beside a kind man than rich beside a cold one. I have watched what rich and cold does to a house." She smiled a little tiredly at her own confession. "So you see, I did not marry you out of despair. I married you out of the only hope I had. It is not much of a compliment to be the best of a bad night, but it is a true one, and I have not many to give." The little book slid from her lap as she spoke, and they both reached for it in the dusk, and their hands met upon the cold worn cover in the dark. He felt her fingers, chapped and small and quick and warm through the chill, close for half a moment over the back of his blackened, lying hand, the hand she had seen through, the hand she had chosen not to name, and neither of them drew away as quickly as they ought. She was very near. He could see the grey light caught along her lashes, and the small pulse at her throat above the washed-out ribbon, and he could have crossed the lost hand's breadth between them as easily as breathing, and for the length of one held, unbearable moment he believed he was going to disguise an oath and the whole careful ruin of his plan be damned. Her breath had stilled. She did not move back. She looked at his hood, at the shadow where his face was, with that quiet inward question he had seen at the wedding fire, there and not spoken, offered and not pressed. And Garvin understood that if he leaned in now she would let him, that she was waiting, poor and married and honest, to be shown which man he was. He drew back. It cost him more than anything he had done in 3 cold years, and he drew back and took his hand from under hers and set the fallen book gently on the ledge between them like a small wall of his own building. Not yet, not with a lie still on his face. He would not her first, whatever came after, in the dark of another woman's cruelty and under the shelter of a name he had not yet dared to give her. She deserved to be come to in the light, by the man himself, knowing his true face. He held to that, though every part of him cried against it, and he saw, he could not help but see, the small flicker cross her own face, not of offence, but of something quieter and sadder, as of a hope she had not quite meant to have, gently setting itself back down. "It grows dark," she said softly after a moment, and there was no reproach in it at all, which was worse than reproach. "They will want the coals banked. We should go down." But they did not go down, not at once. They sat on in the near dark of the ruined book-room. A duke and the woman who did not know it, with a cold hearth and a shelf of her dead father's books and the whole cruel house shut below them, and they talked of the books, and of her father, and of the fen country, and of small foolish things, and Garvin, who had not talked so to any living soul in the memory he cared to keep, heard himself say more than a beggar ought and did not always trouble to roughen it, and saw her mark each slip and fold it quietly away with the rest, keeping his secret with her silence the way she kept the warm half of everything for someone else. It was full night before either of them stirred, and when at last she rose and gathered her shawl, he knew past all pretending that he was not going to be able to give her up, not to the road, not to the door, not to any prudence or fear that had brought him this far. Whatever it cost the Duke of Dunstone, the beggar meant to keep her. They came down the cold stair together into the reach of the kitchen light, and there the good hour ended. Cornelia Charnley stood at the foot of the stair with a candle in her hand and Sir Fenwick's opened post in the other, and her handsome face had a new brightness in it, a hard triumphant pleasure that Garvin had learned to read as a man reads weather. "There you are," she said, and let her eyes go over the two of them, the pauper and the poor relation come down together out of the dark, and her smile widened at what she chose to make of it. "How cosy. I had begun to think we should have to hunt you with dogs." She lifted the letter. "The thaw is come, my dears. The Marrowby Road will be open by Thursday, and we shall have company for it. Sir Julian Crail rides up from town, and half the county with him, to shoot and to dine. He has been these 2 months in London among the great, and is grown very fine, and very fond of a jest." Her eyes moved to Garvin, to the hood, to the crutch, and lingered, and Garvin felt the cold drop in his chest that had nothing to do with the frost, for Julian Crail was a name he knew, a man he had stood within 10 feet of at a card table in St. James's not 18 months gone, a man who had seen the Duke of Dunstone's face by candlelight and would see it again. "I mean to keep you both a few days more," Cornelia said sweetly, "against Thursday. Our friends shall want to hear the tale of the beggar's wedding from the beggar's own bride. It will make such a merry evening." She turned away, satisfied, her candle swaying up the passage. "Do rest, my dear. You will want to look your best when we show you off." Leontine had gone still beside him in the dark of the stair, braced for the fresh humiliation of Thursday, like one who has learned to stand and take what comes, and Garvin, standing beside her with the ruin of his name held under a grey hood and Julian Crail's arrival counting down in his chest like a slow bell, understood that his hidden days were numbered now and few. The thaw would open the road, and the road would bring a man who knew his face, and one way or another, by his own choosing or by another's, the truth was coming. He looked at the woman at his side, who had married her only hope and reached for nothing and been tonight, so near his very heart in the cold, and he knew he could not come by Cornelia Charnley's hand, in a room full of laughter, as one more cruelty done to her. Whatever he did now he must do soon, and he must do carefully, for there were 4 days left before everything he was came up the Marrowby Road to find him. The word came up the frozen walk under the bare limes on the 9th morning, borne by the same thin-serving child, and it undid in a breath the small warm country that Garvin and Leontine had made between them in that cold gatehouse across 9 short nights of talk. He had learned in those nights the whole plain shape of her father the scholar parson who had spent his living upon books, and the poor and died owing both, the guardians who had shuttled her from house to house since, each glad to be quit of the charge. The way she said grace over a heel of bread as though it were a feast, and meant it. He had told her nothing true of himself, and she had asked him nothing, and yet he had come to feel, sitting across the poor fire from her, more truly seen than he had ever been across the polished acres of his own table. Then the child came with her chapped hands and her frightened eyes, and Cornelia's word with her, and the small warm country was gone as though it had never stood. "You're wanted at the house, mistress," the child whispered, and would not look at Leontine as she said it. "All of us are wanted. There's a great gentleman coming, the Duke, they're saying. The Duke of Dunstone himself, that's never been into this county in the memory of anyone, and Miss Charnley's to receive him, and the whole house is to be turned out and made fit, and you're to come and scrub the long gallery, mistress, on your knees, where the guests will walk. Miss Charnley said particular it was to be you." Garvin stood very still by the cold hearth and felt the floor of the world tilt quietly beneath him. He had known, of course, that the invitation must run before him. He had sent it himself weeks since, through his man of business. A letter accepting, in the Duke of Dunstone's cool and distant hand, the eager courtship of a county that had angled after him for a season, naming a day, that very day now near upon them, on which his Grace would honour Standish Court with his presence and see for himself the famous beauty of Miss Charnley, of whom he had heard so much. It had been the last stroke of the whole design, laid before ever he crippled his leg and put on the beggar's coat, that the Duke should come at the end to sweep the mask away, and to see, plainly and before them all, which of the two women beneath that roof had a true heart in her and which a false. He had thought himself so clever. He had not reckoned when he laid it, on the 9th night by the fire, he had not reckoned on wanting, more than he wanted the reckoning itself, only to spare the woman he had married one further hour of that house. On her knees, he said, and his voice came out with less of the beggar's burr in it than he meant. It is nothing, said Leontine, rising, already reaching for the coarse apron she wore for the rough work they still set her. I have scrubbed floors before, and for worse reasons than a duke's boots. Let them have their gallery. But she paused at the door and looked back at him, and there was in her grave face a thing he had not seen there before, not fear for herself, of which she seemed incapable, but a kind of tired knowing. She has not sent for me in 9 days, she said quietly. She let us alone in the cold and thought it punishment enough. If she sends for me now, on the very day her great match walks up the drive, it is not to have the floor clean. It is to have me where she can use me. I do not yet see how. But I would have you keep away from the house today, whatever you hear. You spoke for me once, and it cost you dear. You have not another such coin to spend. Then she was gone, up the walk behind the child, straight-backed in her turned grey wool. And Garvin stood in the doorway of the gatehouse with the cold striking through the rags he had chosen, and watched her go to the trap that neither of them could yet name. And every instinct in him, the instinct of the man who commanded, who had never in his life stood by while a thing was done, rose in him and beat against the beggar's coat like a hawk against a moose. He did not keep away. He could not, and he had known he could not before she was out of sight. He went up to the house on his crutch through the raw grey morning, and he found it in an uproar of consequence. Footmen borrowed from 3 houses, Holland covers stripped from furniture that had not been uncovered in years, Cornelia's voice ringing down the stairs in a fever of command, and no one in all that bustle sparing a glance for one more ragged pensioner shuffling in at the servants' passage to warm himself, which was precisely as he had reckoned. He worked his slow way toward the long gallery, and he was near the door of it, in the dim cross passage where the family portraits hung, when Cornelia's voice rose suddenly over the din into a note he had heard from her only once before, the note of the huntsman who sees the quarry break at last from cover. "Thief!" she cried. "Thief! Hold her, do not let her from the room." Garvin came round the door of the gallery and into a scene arranged, he saw at a single glance, as carefully as the wedding feast had been arranged. Leontine stood in the middle of the long, bright room with her scrubbing cloth still in her reddened hand, and about her in a half-circle stood Cornelia and Sir Fenwick and the elder cousin and 2 of the borrowed footmen, and at Cornelia's feet, cast down upon the wet flags where any eye must fall on it, lay a thing that caught the grey window light and threw it back in cold white fire, a great clasp of diamonds and pearls, the aigrette she had plainly meant to wear that very evening to receive her duke. "From my own chamber," Cornelia was saying, and her voice shook with a grief so beautifully mounted that 2 of the neighbour ladies, come early to be in at the meeting, pressed their hands to their bosoms in sympathy. "From the very drawer of my own dressing table, while she was set to clean the room, and found not an hour after, found where, Fenwick, tell them where your footman found it, in the beggar's gatehouse. Rolled in a stocking in the pauper's own bundle, thrust behind the hearthstone." She turned her handsome, streaming, triumphant face upon the gathering room. "I took her in my own blood near enough, and fallen so low, and I gave her a roof and a husband and my own charity, and this is how I am repaid. Send to Merrowby for the magistrate. Send for Mr. Brereton this hour. I will have the law upon her, gentlewoman or no. It is a hanging matter, or transportation at the least, and by heaven she shall answer for it before the whole county." There it was, whole and finished, and Garvin understood it entire in the space of a breath, the way one understands a chessboard fallen suddenly into a mate one should have foreseen 10 moves gone. She had not brought Leontine up to scrub a floor. She had brought her up to be alone in the room with the jewels, that the accusation might stand, and she had sent her footman to the gatehouse to plant the aigrette while the pair of them were from it, and she meant to have her rival taken up and galed and ruined and gone, out of the house and out of the county and out of all remembrance, before the Duke of Dunstone's carriage turned in at the gate that evening, so that when his Grace came to survey the beauty he had heard of, there should be nothing near her but her own gracious sorrow, and no poor grey shadow of a cousin to shame the family with her rags. It was, Garvan thought, with a cold that had nothing of the winter in it, the cleverest cruelty he had seen her do, and it might have been made on purpose to catch him, for there was no answer to it that a beggar could give. He had commanded men who broke nations. He had sat across green tables from ministers, and read the small betraying flickers of their faces as another man reads print, and he stood now in the one corner of the world where all of that was worth precisely nothing, where his word carried no further than the reach of his ragged arm, where the truth itself, spoken plainly by a pauper, was only one more thing to be laughed at and set aside. He had made himself powerless on purpose, to see who would be to a man who could do nothing for them. He had his answer, and the answer was about to be dragged out of the room in irons, because the man who loved her had built himself, stroke by careful stroke, into a creature no one need believe. Leontine had not moved. She looked down at the diamonds on the flags and then up at Cornelia, and when she spoke it was in the same clear, unhurried voice that had faltered the whole table on her wedding night. And it did not falter now. I did not take it, she said. You know I did not, for you know where it slept last night, and it was behind my hearthstone. I have carried nothing out of this house in 9 days but the bread you grudged me. But I see that my knowing it, and your knowing it, will weigh very little against a diamond found in a stocking in a room full of people who would rather it were true. So send for your magistrate, cousin. I will not run from him. I have run from nothing under this roof yet, and I will not begin with a thing I did not do. How well she speaks, said Cornelia softly to the room and dabbed at her dry eyes. They always speak so well, the clever poor. Fenwick, the magistrate. And Garvan, from the shadow of the doorway, watched the master of the house nod, and watched a footman turn to go, and felt the whole edifice of his careful patience come down in him at once and forever. He had told himself, through 11 days and then through 9 nights more, that a man learns nothing behind a mask he tears off at the first sting. He had told himself that his pride, which had ruined him once 3 years gone, in a lamplit corridor, when he had overheard the woman he was to have married pricing his affection to her sister like a length of goods, and had walked out of that house and out of the reach of every soft thing in the world, his pride must be given no more trust. He had built the whole of this masquerade upon the belief that a heart could only be proved true when it did not know it was being watched, and he had watched. And Leontine's heart had proved truer than he had dared to dream a heart could be, and now for the sake of that same proof he was to stand mute in a doorway in another man's rags, and let them carry her off to a gale on a rope. He found that he could not. He found that all the reasons were dust in his mouth. There was no proof in the world worth the price of her, and the discovery of it went through him like the breaking of a long fever. He came forward into the light. You will not send for the magistrate, he said, and this time he did not trouble to bury the other man in his voice at all. It came out full and level and quiet, and used to being obeyed, and the sound of it turned every head in the long gallery as a single low bell will turn a crowd. You will not lay a hand upon her, nor a word against her from this moment forward. The jewel was never stolen. It was carried to the gatehouse last night by that man. He lifted the head of his crutch toward the footman by the window, who went the colour of tallow. Upon your order, madam. Given on the back stair after the house was abed, and it was found by another this morning where he had left it. And there is not one soul in this room, yourself the foremost, who does not know in their heart that what I say is true. For a moment the fine mounted grief drained clean out of Cornelia's face, and left only the fury he had seen twice now, the white unaccountable fury of a woman whose peace has looked back at her from the board, and then she recovered herself, and her mouth curled, and Garvan knew, an instant before she spoke, exactly the door he had left open, and exactly how she would come through it, and who, she said, sweet again, turning to spread the ruin of him before her audience with an open, gracious hand. Who shall we thank for this fine testimony? Not a witness, not a gentleman, not a man with a name or a shilling or a whole leg to stand on, a beggar off the Marrowby road, that we took in out of pity and married to a thief out of charity, and who now stands in my own gallery and gives the lie to his betters as bold as a bishop. Hear how he talks. Hear it. Where does a tinker learn to talk so, I wonder, unless from listening at the doors of his betters? She laughed, and looked round for the room to laugh with her, and some of them did uncertainly, for the beggar's voice had frightened them and her laugh gave them leave to pretend it had not. You have overreached yourself, my man. A wife may lie for her husband and a husband for his wife. It is nature, and it is worth exactly nothing. Two papas swearing each other honest. Fenwick, send for Brereton, and while he is about it he may take up the pair of them, for I'll warrant the man's as deep in it as she. Let them hang in company. It is the only wedding journey they are like to have. The footman went. The door at the far end of the gallery opened and closed upon him, and beyond it, faint and terrible, came the sound of a horn from the drive and the grind of iron-shod wheels upon the frozen gravel. Some early carriage, some neighbour, some herald of the greater carriage still to come. But it fell upon that room like the striking of a clock that cannot be called back. Leontine turned her head at the sound, and then she looked across the length of the bright cold gallery at the beggar she had married, at the man who had just thrown away whatever safety his rags had bought him to speak for a second time, and been mocked down into ruin for it a second time, and there was in her grave dark eyes no reproach at all, and no fear for herself, but only a great and sorrowing tenderness. As one looks at a person one has come to prize who has hurt himself past mending on one's own account. You should not have, she said to him very low, across all that distance and all those staring faces, as though there were no one in the room but the two of them by their poor fire. Oh, you should not have. Now they will have us both, and I cannot bear it that they should have you. I told you you had not another such coin. And then, because she was who she was, she lifted her chin and turned back to face them all, and set herself squarely between the beggar and the room as she had done in the hall on the first day, ready to spend on his account the last worthless farthing of her name. And Garvin, standing crippled and ragged and unbelieved in the enemy's gallery, with the wheels of his own coming turning upon the gravel outside, and the woman he loved throwing her broken shield across his body, felt the last of the mask crack through and fall away inside him, though not one thread of the beggar's coat had yet stirred. There was but one man on the earth whose word could stop the magistrate at the gate and lift her clear of the rope, and that man had been standing all this while inside the rags, waiting for a proof he no longer wanted, and the hour had come at last, ready or no, when he must cease to be the beggar and be the duke, and let the whole cruel county see at one stroke whom they had crowned in dead leaves and whom they had wept for, or lose her past all reaching, behind the door the footman had just gone through. He drew one long breath and set his weight, quite evenly now, upon both his sound legs and lifted his head, and everything in that room, and everything he had come 3 counties and 39 guarded years to find, hung entire upon the truth he was about to speak. The word thief had scarcely left Cornelia Charnley's mouth before the whole long table went still, and in that stillness Garvin felt the last of his patience burn out of him like a candle pinched between 2 fingers. She had waited for her full house to do it. The county sat ranged down either side of the cold bright board, 23 of the neighbourhood in their best, the candlelight jumping in the glasses, and at the head of them Sir Julian Crail lounged in his London coat with a smile already half made, and it was into that silence, with the timing of a woman who had rehearsed the moment in her mind a dozen times, that Cornelia had risen and held up the little garnet clasp that was her own and had never left her own, and said in a voice pitched to carry to the farthest cloth that it had been found tucked in the poor bride's bedding, and that she was grieved, only grieved, to think what charity had sheltered. Leontine stood where they had made her stand, at the foot of the table. In the washed grey gown and the borrowed ribbon they had dressed her in for the sport of it, and she did not weep, and she did not plead, and Garvan, watching from the shadow by the sideboard where a beggar husband had been suffered to lean upon his crutch and be laughed at between the courses, saw her lift her chin and go very white and very still, and understood that this was the flaw being struck at last out of the widow's account. This was not a jest for an evening. A thief could be turned onto the marrow by road within the hour, and no magistrate in the county would trouble himself. A thief had no name, no place, no father's reproach to stand crooked in a grasping woman's door. Cornelia had found, before witnesses enough to make it law in the mouths of the whole shire by Sunday, the one lie that would carry Leontine Standish out of the house forever and leave the way clear behind her. "I have taken nothing from this house," Leontine said, and her voice did not shake, which cost her. Garvin could see it cost her. "That was not given me to earn thrice over. I will not stand here and argue my own honesty against a woman who has none. Send for the constable if you mean to." "I will go with him, and I will say the same to him that I say to you. You hear her," Cornelia said softly to the table, spreading her hands as one grieved past speech. "No shame in it at all. That is what want does to a person, Sir Julian. It eats the shame out of them like a worm in an apple. My poor husband's brother took her in out of Christian pity, and see how she repays a roof." Down the table a lady tittered behind her glove. A man said low that it was ever the way with charity cases, and Sir Fenwick, 3 parts gone in his cups at the board's head, only stared into his wine and would not lift his eyes to his brother's child, because Cornelia had told him what he was to think, and he had long since given up the labour of thinking otherwise. And Julian Crail, gathering himself to be amusing, turned his handsome idle face toward the beggar in the corner and said, for the pleasure of the room, "And what says the bridegroom? Come, fellow, does your wife rob her betters? Speak up. We are all agog to hear the beggar defend his thief." Garvin set down the crutch. He did not throw it. He had rehearsed nothing, had planned this hour to come 100 quieter ways than this. But there was no quiet way left in the world now, and so he simply set the crutch against the sideboard with a small, deliberate care. As a man sets down a tool he is finished with, and he straightened. He straightened all the way, unbending the shoulders he had carried stooped for 11 days, and then 4 more, letting the false drag go out of the ruined foot, coming up to the whole grave height of himself in the candlelight. And he backed the grey hood from his head with one blackened hand, and lifted his face and let the room look at it. The change went down the table like a draught putting out flames. The tittering stopped. Julian Crail's smile did not fall so much as freeze upon his mouth, and then slide off it altogether, and the colour went out of his London face, and he came half out of his chair with his hand flat upon the cloth, staring, and it was Crail, of course it was Crail, who had stood within 10 feet of him at a card table in St. James's and would know that face in his sleep, who said the name first, in a voice gone thin with disbelief, into a silence you might have heard a pin turn in. "Dunstone." "Garvin Ashcombe," the Duke said, and his own voice, unround at last, came out of him low and level and terrible in the stillness, the voice that had brought ministers to heel and been obeyed across half the north, and it filled the cold room to its cornices without his once raising it. "The 7th Duke of Dunstone, Marquess of Harrow, Baron Ashcombe of Vale, and as of Tuesday se'night before God and Mr. Peveril on a fire in your still room, the husband of that lady you have this hour named a thief." No one spoke. Somewhere down the table a glass was set down untasted with a small chime that was the loudest thing in the house. Cornelia Charnley stood with the garnet clasp still lifted in her fingers, and Garvin watched the certainty drain out of her handsome face by degrees. Watched her look from him to Crail on back, hunting some flaw, some jest, some way it might yet be turned to her account, and finding, for the first time since he had come into this house, that there was none. "You are mad," she said, but the words came out without their weight. "You are a beggar. I found you at Marrowby Fair on the alms stones. You were pointed out to me. You are." "I was pointed out to you," Garvin agreed, "because I paid 2 shillings to the man who pointed. I sat upon the alms stones 11 days that you might find me there. I blacked my own hands. I bound my own foot. I let your grooms strike me across the shoulders in the yard, and I carried your coals up your scullery stair with the whole of a false lameness dragging behind me. And I heard, madam, a very great deal from servants who did not trouble to lower their voices over a man they thought too low to matter." He came forward from the sideboard as he spoke, unhurried, into the light, and the county gentry drew back their chairs from by inches without knowing they did it. I know your footman Dice is owed 11 months' wage and paid the arrears in threats. I know your still-room maid has not been paid at all since Michaelmas and stays for fear of a character you have promised to blacken. I know that you mean to be mistress of this house in law, or in fact, and that you have been these 2 years pouring drink into that poor ruin at the head of the table." Sir Fenwick flinched as though struck, and did not raise his head, the better to keep him from his own hand and his own will. "And I know there was but one thing you could not carry off, one flaw in the whole account, one person who wore a dead man's face and would not be made to go. So you found her a thief tonight, before the county, that she might be gone by morning and the way left clear." He stopped, and looked at the garnet clasp still frozen in her upraised hand. "That is your own. It has never been out of your keeping. You drew it from your own reticule as you drew a wedding ring from it a fortnight since, and for the same reason, because it is a small cheap thing, and you thought no one of consequence was watching. You cannot prove," she began. "I am the Duke of Dunstone," Garvan said, quite gently, and the gentleness was the worst of it, "and I have watched you for a fortnight from the floor of your own scullery. I do not need to prove it. I need only say it, and by Sunday every house from here to Marrowby will know that Cornelia Charnley cried thief upon a duchess to steal a drunkard's estate, and there is not a door in the county that will open to you after." He let that stand a moment in the terrible quiet. "You may keep the clasp. You have earned it. You will not keep this house. It was Crail who broke Crail, who had the most to lose of any man there, who had sat and laughed and been made a part of it, and who now flung himself upright and stammered that he had known nothing, nothing at all, that he had come to shoot and dine, and had been imposed upon as cruelly as any, and would his grace only believe that he had never." And Garvan turned upon him one long look, the flat grey level look he had used across council tables. Julian Crail's protestations died in his throat, and he sat down. Down the whole length of the board the county was rising now in a scrape and clatter of chairs, and Garvan saw the thing he had seen 100 times and never once with any pleasure. The tide going out from the one who had been strong and rushing in about the one who wore a coronet, the same mouths that had tittered behind gloves now framing themselves to be kind. A lady who had laughed loudest not 2 minutes since was gazing at Leontine with a soft appalled tenderness, as though she had loved her all along. It sickened him, and it was justice, and both those things were true at once. But Cornelia was not yet done. He had known her a fortnight, and he ought to have known she would not go down without she took someone with her, and she turned now, quick and cornered and vicious, not upon him, she had learned that much, but upon the girl at the foot of the table. And her voice came out with the last of her venom in it. "And you," she said to Leontine, "you knew, you canting, close-mouthed little, you knew what he was, and you kept it, and you let me play the fool at my own table. You have been laughing at every one of us behind that meek face for a fortnight." She knew nothing. Garvan said it fast, and too loud, the first words the whole evening that had come out of him without their weight and measure, because it had gone through him all at once, cold as the still room dark, what this looked like from where Leontine stood. He turned from Cornelia. He forgot Cornelia. She was nothing, she was already finished, she was a matter for lawyers and gossips. He turned to his wife, and he saw that the harm was already done. She was looking at him. She was looking at him as she had never once looked at the beggar, not with the quiet inward question she had offered him in the firelight and the cold book-room, the question that had asked which man he was and waited, kind and unpressing, to be shown. That question was gone. In its place was a stillness he had not seen on her before, and would have given the whole of Dunstone never to have put there, the stillness of a person who has just understood that they have been managed. He watched her look at his straight shoulders and his sound foot and his lifted, unhooded face, the true face, come to her at last, but come like this, in a blaze of exposure, before 23 gaping strangers, and not one word of it from his own mouth in the dark where she had trusted him. He watched her reckon, quick as she reckoned everything, the 11 days he had sat upon the almstones to be chosen, the 2 shillings paid, the whole vast machine of his masquerade grinding along beneath her small acts of kindness. He watched her understand that the beggar she had given the warm half of everything to, the beggar she had shielded with her silence, and told the true story of her father, and confessed she had married out of her only hope, that this man had been, the entire while, a duke amusing himself with a search, testing hearts, and that hers had been the one that passed. Leontine, he said. You watched me 11 days, she said. Her voice was very low and quite steady, which was worse, far worse, than if it had broken, at the fair. Before ever they chose you. She was not asking. She was setting it in its place, the way she set books straight, the way she had folded away every slip he made and never named. You arranged to be chosen. You paid a man to be pointed out. And then you sat in my father's book room in the cold, and let me tell you I had married you out of hope, and let me. She stopped. Her chin came up, that same brave lift she had used against Cornelia, only there was no armor in it now, only a wound she was too proud to let bleed in front of the county. I told you I would sooner be poor beside a kind man than rich beside a cold one. And you sat there in your borrowed rags and let me say it, knowing you were the richest cold man in the north. I am not cold, Garvin said. It came out of him rough and low and nothing like a duke, and he took a step toward her, and she took one back, and that single step it stopped him where he stood as no man's sword had ever stopped him. Leontine, I beg you, every word you told me I have kept, every word. I did not laugh. God is my witness, I have not laughed once in this house except at what it cost me not to weep. I came here a cynic to prove there was no true heart left in England, and I found yours. And it did not vindicate me, it undid me, it has ruined every plan I ever. You should have told me, she said, in the dark, when it was only us, when it would have cost you something. Her eyes were bright now, and she would not let them fall. You waited until it would win you a room, and she turned, there before the whole staring county, before the humbled woman and the frozen London gallant and the drunkard who at last had lifted his ruined face to look at his brother's child. She turned, and gathered the washed grey gown in one chapped hand, and walked out of the cold, bright dining room with her back straight, and her step unhurried, out through the door at the foot of the hall into the dark of the passage beyond, and left the Duke of Dunstone standing in the wreck of his own reckoning with 23 faces turned upon him and the one face he wanted gone. For the space of a breath he could not move. He had faced down parliaments. He had buried a wife who deceived him and closed his heart with his own 2 hands, and kept it closed 3 years against every soft assault. He had crossed half of England on the strength of a bitter wager with himself, and won it, and found in the winning the only thing he had ever truly wanted. And he had, in the very hour of finding it, by his own long cleverness, very nearly lost it out the door. The whole triumph he had built, the widow shamed and the county cowed, and the truth blazing at last in the light, was ash in his mouth. He did not care one straw for any of it. There was a woman walking away down a dark cold passage who had given her warmth to a beggar and asked nothing, and who thought now that she had been a fool for it, and that was the single unbearable fact in the world. He was moving before he had decided to. He crossed the length of the dining room in a stride and a half, past Cornelia charnely white and ruined against the wall, past Crail, past the risen gaping county, and he did not just glance at them, for they had ceased utterly to exist. At the door the old stooped servant stood with a rushlight burning in his hand, had stood there, Garvin understood in passing, through the whole of it, keeping his silence to the last as he had kept it from the first night with the lantern, and the old man stepped aside to let him through. And this once, this last once, the lined old face was not without expression. There was something in it very like a blessing, and something very like grief, and he tipped the light down the passage the way she had gone as though he had only ever waited to be of this one use. Go quickly, your grace, the old man said. She walks fast when she is hurt, and she will be for the road. Garvin went. He went out of the light and into the cold dark of the house he had learned on his hands and knees, past the east stair and the shut book room and the still room where they had lodged him like a beast, with the true face bare to the frost at last and no crutch to slow him and no disguise left in all the world to hide behind. A duke in beggar's rags running through a ruined house after the one heart he had crossed 3 counties to find and could not, would not, dared not lose, and ahead of him in the dark, faint and quick and already far, he heard the sound of a door, and the bitter open breath of the winter night coming in. The name had gone through the long gallery like a stone through river ice. Dunstone, Dunstone, whispered and gasped and disbelieved from the great fireplace to the far door. and in the ringing silence that came after it, while men who had jeered at a beggar not an hour since stood rooted upon the boards, uncertain whether to bow or to bolt, Garvin turned to find the one face in all that bright cold room he had cast off the rags to see, and found the place by the poor fire where she had stood, and found it empty. For a single heartbeat the Duke of Dunstone, who had turned duchesses out of his own drawing-room and made ministers wait a fortnight upon his pleasure, did not know what to do. He had rehearsed this reckoning 100 times upon the road north, the widow's face when the truth fell, the squire's stammer, the magistrate bowing to the floor, and now that the hour had struck he found he cared nothing at all for any of it. Because the only person whose eyes he had wanted upon him at the breaking of the mask had chosen that very moment to slip away between the staring backs and be gone. He understood it even as the fear of it closed his throat. She had loved a beggar. He had watched her love a beggar, and had built the whole ruined edifice of his heart upon the fact of it. And now the beggar was dead in the space of one spoken word, and a great cold stranger stood in his place wearing the beggar's face. And she had done the only thing a proud woman could do who has spent her last warmth upon a poor man and learned in an instant that she had been spending it, all the while, upon a lord who had never wanted for a fire in his life. My lord, it was Brereton the magistrate, come up the drive too late for the arrest he had been summoned to make and just in time to be undone by it, bowing now so low that the seals swung from his waistcoat. My Lord Duke, I had no notion. The letter said only, "You will detain no one under my name and no one under Sir Fenwick's," Garvin said, and did not look at him, for he had already stooped and taken up the false foot and the beggar's crutch that had carried his masquerade 3 counties and 11 bitter days. And he set them down again upon the squire's own table with a small deliberate sound that made the whole room flinch. "There will be a reckoning here, and you shall have your part in it, but it will wait upon my convenience." "Where is she?" No one answered him. Cornelia Charnley stood a little apart, and her handsome face, that face which had performed grief and concern and tender ivy-clinging duty over this poor house for a 12-month, had gone the grey of old ash, for she of all of them had understood soonest and most completely what the word Dunstone had swept off the board. She had staked a year of patient cruelty upon becoming mistress of Standish Court, and she saw now that she had built her whole account upon abusing, before witnesses, the wife of the most powerful man in 3 counties. She did not speak. She had the wit, at least, to know that nothing she could say would not be used to hang her higher. "Where is she?" Garvin said again, and this time it was very quiet, and Sir Fenwick, propped upon his gouty stool with the crushed creditor's letter still somewhere about him, lifted a shaking hand and pointed at the ceiling, up toward the cold north rooms where nothing of any value was kept, and Garvin was gone before the old man's arm had fallen again. He knew the way. He had hauled coals up that scullery stair with a false foot dragging behind him. He had learned every warped tread of it in the character of a thing too low to be seen. He took it now 3 steps at a time in his own stride, whole and swift, through the sleeping cold of the great shabby house to the little book-room under the eaves where he had felt the last of his 3 years' wall go quietly to nothing beside a dead hearth. The door stood ajar. And there in the failing grey afternoon light, kneeling among the mean crates that held all that a bankrupt scholar had left his daughter, she was folding a shawl about a handful of her father's books as a woman folds a blanket about a child she means to carry out into the snow. Leontine. She did not turn at once. Her hands went still upon the worn covers, and he saw her breath make its small ghost upon the freezing air, and when she did rise and face him she had schooled her grave dark eyes into a courtesy so perfect and so distant that it was worse than any weeping could have been. "Your Grace," she said, "you will forgive me. I was only taking what is mine before I went. My father's books. No one will miss them. My uncle thought them worthless, and he was right, save to me." She lifted her chin in the old way. "I shall trouble your household no further. I understand there was never any marriage. A beggar and a girl, sworn over a cold fire by a hedge priest. It will be the simplest thing in the world to set aside, and I will not contest it, and you need never stop." He had not meant it to come so rough. He stood in the doorway with his hands open at his sides, this man whom 3 counties trembled at, and he found he could not cross the little room, because as everything he had come across half of England to reach was standing 4 paces off with her arms full of her dead father's books. Calling him your grace in a voice like a shut door, do not say the rest of it. I beg you. There is no man living I would let say that sentence, and I will not let you say it either, for it is the only cruel thing I have ever heard in your mouth, and you do not mean it. I do not know what I mean, she said, and there at last, the courtesy cracked, and something raw came up through it. How should I know what I mean? An hour ago I had a husband. He was lame, and he was poor, and he ate at the scullery door, and he was the truest thing that had ever come into my life, and I would have gone out on the roads with him this very night and counted myself rich, and now they tell me he was never there at all. Now they tell me I was kind to a duke who was watching me to see how a poor girl behaves when she thinks no one who matters is looking. Her voice broke on it. Was that it? Was I an amusement? A study? Did you come to Standish Court to see how the low speak of one another and stay to see how the low love? The word went into him like a blade, because it was so near the truth of why he had come and so utterly wrong about what he had found. He crossed the room then. He did not touch her. He had learned, in 11 days of watching her, that she was not a woman to be reached by seizing, but he came close enough that she had to lift her face to his, and he let her see, for the first time in 3 guarded years, the whole of what was in him undefended. I will tell you why I came, and I will tell you the truth of it, and you shall judge me for it however you please, he said low. 3 years ago I loved a woman who loved my name, and my lands, and the great cold house at Dunstone, and had a marvellous gift for seeming to love me, and I did not learn the difference until it had very near unmade me. After that I found I could not tell one smile from another. Every kindness done me I weighed like a coin, to see was it true metal or gilt, and after long enough a man who does that grows unfit for any warmth at all, for he has taught himself that warmth is only the prettiest kind of lie. I came here in another man's rags because I had heard a mad, desperate notion into my own head, that if a heart truly disinterested existed anywhere upon the earth, it would be found where there was nothing to be got by pretending, at the very bottom of the world, in the way the low are used when the great believe no one is listening. I did not come to find you. I came to prove to myself that you could not exist. He drew a breath, and it shook. And then you gave the beggar the warm half of everything you had, which was almost nothing, and kept his secret with your silence, and set your worthless name like a shield across his body before that whole gallery, twice, when it could win you nothing but the rope. You did not know I was a duke. You knew I was a ragged cripple who could do you no good in this world and a great deal of harm, and you loved me anyway, plainly asking nothing. Do you understand what that is, to a man who had forgotten such a thing was possible? You did not undo my caution, Leontine. You undid the whole of the man I had made of myself to bear my life, and left me nothing to be but honest, and I stood down there in that gallery and let 100 people learn my name for one reason only. Because your neck was under Brereton's writ, and I would have owned myself before the king himself sooner than let them touch you. I deceived you, and I am more sorry for the days of it than I have words, and I will beg your pardon on my knees in front of every soul in this house, if that is what it wants. But do not, I entreat you, do not tell me I was watching you as one watches a curious animal. I was watching you as a man watches the one warm window in a country of snow, and knowing he will die if he cannot get inside it. She was weeping now quietly, the way she did everything without display, and she had not stepped back. You should have told me, she whispered, by the cold hearth. That night, you let so much of yourself slip, and I gathered every piece of it up and hid it away, and I thought it was the beggar trusting me, and it was the sweetest thing I owned. You should have told me and let me choose. I could not bear to watch your face change at the word, he said. That was the whole of my cowardice, and I will own it. I had watched a face change at that word once. I could not watch it happen to the one face. He stopped. Change it now then, it is said. I am the Duke of Dunstone, and I have lands you have never seen and more than I know what to do with. And I laid gold upon you at that door before the county as I meant it, before I had any right, and I want nothing under heaven so much as I want you to be my wife in truth, on any terms you name. There, your face has the word. What does it do? For a long moment she only looked at him. the tears standing in her grave dark eyes, the shawl full of father's poor books still clutched to her breast between them like the last of her fortune. And then she did a thing that he carried in his heart to the end of his days. She set the books down, carefully, upon the crate, as though they were the thing that had been keeping her from him, and she reached up and laid her chapped, work-roughened hand against his jaw. Against the beggar's stubble he had not yet shaved away, and she said, unsteadily, but plainly in the voice that had never in his hearing flattered a living soul, "I do not want the Duke of Dunstone. God forgive me, my lord, I do not care one farthing for him, and I never shall, and if you have come all this way to be loved for that name, you have wasted your journey as thoroughly as ever a man did." Her mouth trembled toward the ghost of her old dry humor. "I want the man who was too proud to weep in front of me and did it anyway over my father's books. I want the one who carried coals so a widow could not say, 'I ate charity,' and never told me. I would have taken him on the roads tonight with nothing, and I will take him now with everything. But it is the same man I am taking, and if ever you doubt for 1 hour of your life which of us was true, I shall be very angry with you, for it is a foolish question and you know the answer already." And she smiled at him through the tears. The whole warm, undefended smile she had spent so freely upon a beggar and so seldom upon the world that had used her, and Garvan, Duke of Dunstone, feared through 3 counties, gathered the overlooked girl of Standish Court into his arms in the cold book-room under the eaves and held her as though were the one warm thing in a country of snow, which was precisely what she was. He took her down himself, a long while after, upon his arm, into the great gallery where the county still stood milling and murmuring and afraid to leave, and if there had been any doubt remaining in that room as to whom the Duke of Dunstone had chosen, the sight of him bringing the ill-clad, red-eyed niece down the stair with her hand tucked close and covered by his own put an end to it forever. He did not raise his voice. He had never in his life needed to. "This is my wife," he said, and let the words stand in the silence until every powdered head had understood them. "The Duchess of Dunstone. She has kept this house through a year in which not one of you who ate at its table lifted a finger to spare her a single unkindness. And I have watched you do it from the servant's door, and I forget nothing." His eye moved to Cornelia Charnley, standing grey and rigid by the cold windows, and it was not anger in his face but something colder and more final. "You meant to be mistress here, madam. I have read the whole of your account, the wages unpaid. The old man kept drunk that he might be led. The will you have been these 6 months, waiting to have signed over a dead man's living daughter. Mr. Brereton will find it makes instructive reading, and Mr. Brereton, I think, is very anxious to be useful to me this afternoon." Brereton bowed again, wretchedly, and Cornelia's white face told them all she understood that the county which had smiled at her cruelty would now compete to be first to abandon her, and she gathered the wreck of her dignity and went from the room, and out of their story, unwept and unfollowed, into a small and diminished remainder of her life that no one present ever troubled to inquire after. To Sir Fenwick, gouty and trembling and half sober upon his stool, the Duke was gentler than the old man had earned, for Leontine's hand had tightened upon his sleeve at the sight of her uncle's fright, and Garvan had already learned to read the whole language of that hand. "Your debts will be looked to," he said, "not for your sake, but for hers, that she may never be told her own people were ruined on her wedding day. You will keep your house, you will keep it soberly, and you will keep in it a civil tongue toward your betters, of whom your niece is now the first in this county after none but me." And the old man wept, which cost him nothing and mended nothing, but Leontine forgave him with a look, because she was made that way, and Garvan honoured it, because he had crossed half of England to find precisely that mercy, and would not now presume to correct it. They were married again in the spring properly, in the grey stone church at Dunstone, though he told her a dozen times over that he had never for one moment doubted the first vows, sworn by a hedge priest over a cold fire between a beggar and the truest woman in England. Her father's books came south in his own carriage, every worthless, priceless crate of them, and he had a room made for them at Dunstone with a great southern window, and a fire that was never let go out, because she had told him once that books were the only riches no bailiff could carry off. And he found he could not rest until he had given her the one fortune she had ever named for herself. He hung no portraits of himself in that room. He hung only her at the end of it, painted small and plain in the mended shawl she had worn the day he first saw her. Because he never wished to forget, and never did, what he had been down on his knees in the dead leaves searching for, nor how nearly he had walked past it in his fine cold certainty that it could not exist, in the years that came, and there were many of them, and they were kind. The Duke of Dunstone remained a man that ministers waited upon, and that his tenants spoke of with a respect gone soft at the edges with affection, for the great house had thawed in a way none of them could quite name. But those who watched him closely learned the true measure of him from one small thing. However full the room, however grave the business, when the Duchess came into it he turned to her the way a cold man turns to a window with the sun in it, plainly, without guard, before them all. The once guarded, once feared master of 3 counties, cherishing to the end of his days the one overlooked, unregarded, gently laughing woman whom the whole proud world had looked past, and whom he alone in another man's rags had been wise enough at last to see.